Good morning. I'm a congregational rabbi, and I learned that if you don't tell Jews what the point of the sermon is at the very beginning, they'll sleep through the end when you get to it. So here's the point of the sermon. The greatest piece of American cinema ever filmed, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. And the greatest scene in The Wizard of Oz is that almost penultimate, the last color scene, the penultimate scene of the movie, where Glenda the Witch shows up before Wicked, and we found out what she was really like. But when Glenda the Witch shows up and she tells Dorothy two things. Number one, home is real, and you could always get there on your own. And that's what Noah and I have come all the way from California to tell you. We can succeed. We can rescue this. We can build a movement of Jewish life that is compelling and meaningful, that will draw people from their homes, from their lives, and enrich those lives. We can do it. But there's no simple technical secret. There's no website, there's no software, there's no single program, there's no protocol, there's no melody for Adon Olam that's suddenly going to change all of Jewish life. It is a long and arduous process of development, of learning, of experimentation, of innovation, of development, and most of all, it has to come from within. And we have within the community, within lay leaders and teachers and rabbis and cantors and friends of the community, the capacity to carry forward that process. All we have to do is find it within and find the courage to make it real. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Shkoyach.
Please meet my dear friend, Rabbi Noah Kushner. Rabbi Kushner is the rabbi of a place that's not even called a synagogue, it's called the Kitchen. And we'll ask her about that in a moment. But the Kitchen is one of a network of new congregations that have risen across the country that are now called emergent communities. Emergent communities have in common a sort of creative bent, a different way of doing Jewish. And what's remarkable is how powerful they have become in attracting young Jews and the energy that they've created and the loyalty and commitment they've created. And the Kitchen in San Francisco is one of the most extraordinary, partly because of the commitment and joy and spirit of the place, and I've been there many times, and partly because it takes place in San Francisco, which if you ever look on a map is about as far west as you can get. It's as far into the culture of disruption and change, as far into the culture of assimilation and secularization that you can get. And in the midst of that culture, Rabbi Kushner has managed to create a beautiful, living, and vibrant and learning Jewish community. So let's begin by asking you, how did you do that? And what were the lessons of your experience at the Kitchen that we can take home today?
Thanks. And, of course, you're not supposed to teach in front of your teachers, so let's just say that whenever Rabbi Feinstein comes to San Francisco to teach, which blessedly is often, I drop whatever I'm doing and I go to hear whatever it is he has to say. I was giving Josh Rabin, who graciously invited me, a hard time about the word innovation. And I know it's all over this conference, and a lot of times people will connect me to the word innovation. And I was saying this in my last session, that I don't like the word innovation. I like the word translation. Innovation means we're starting something new and we're making something up, but that betrays the fact that we have something very, very precious and something very, very profound. And our job is actually not to make up something new or try to compete with the language of the marketplace and layer over on what we already have to try to make it into something that it's not. Our job is simply to translate this precious thing that we have, Torah, Jewish life, Jewish experience, love for one another, into this time and place. And it is very hard work. And so I talk about creating an opportunity for us to connect heaven and earth. So I think we've made a false dichotomy. I think we've said we either have content and Torah and it's strong, or we have access and welcoming and branding. It's one or the other. You have to pick. Choose your lane, right? The problem is it's a false dichotomy. We have to have both. If we have this beautiful erudite Torah and nobody can reach it and nobody can access it and the places that own it are like guarded fortresses to the uninitiated, then we haven't done our job. And at the same time, if we have a really exciting and current and relevant, welcoming place, but there's no Torah in it and there's no real practice in it, then we haven't reached heaven and we also haven't done our job. So we have to figure out a way to do both. You know, I was having coffee with I meet a lot of people in the startup world. Anyone with a new idea calls me, and because I'm called the kitchen, I get a lot of funny calls. I even got a call once from this woman who wanted to get into like the kosher pickling business, and I had to politely tell her I don't cook, I know nothing about pickles. I tried to direct her to somebody who could help her. But I met with someone who had a beautiful idea about creating a website for Torah and having all different interpretations of Torah on this website. And I said, I understand this is a beautiful idea, and in Israel I could imagine how it would be very popular, but in America, who's going to look at the site? Explain to me how you're going to reach the people and connect them to the site. And he said, I think I just want the people who already like Torah. And something in that conversation, I actually argued with him. It made me very angry. I said, our Torah is so precious, and you're telling me you want to limit it just to the people who already know about it? Isn't it our responsibility to try to figure out those people who might want to learn something and help them read too? Right? So I think on the one side, we can become very insular, and that's one of the dangers. And then on the other side, we can become quite frivolous. But if we can hang on to both of those poles and create a tension between them, we can, in fact, create heaven and earth. And I do believe it's very hard work, but I believe it's the only path. And that's the first thing of 3 or 4 things I've learned at the kitchen. The second thing is, I would say about once a week, and again, I'm in San Francisco. The unaffiliation rate of Gen X in 2006 was 90%. I think it's probably higher now. I'd like to say that doing Jewish institutional Western religion is about the most countercultural thing you can do in San Francisco. Yoga is the norm. But about once or twice a week, a couple will sit in front of me. One is a Jew, maybe someone who went to Camp Ramah, someone who went to Israel, someone who's connected, and usually they're with someone they fell in love with who's not Jewish. And I just look at the two of them and I say the following, something like, I love you both and I want you to be a real part of what we're doing here. And the person who's not Jewish usually cries, and we go from there. I'm not going to tell you how to run your shul. These are very complicated questions around identity. I know Yehuda was speaking about some of them yesterday. But I think the elephant in the room has to do with how we perceive identity and the first question that we ask when people come. So I decided I was tired of being, and I appreciate this is a radical position, but I decided I was tired of being a toll booth worker and of checking people's pedigrees at the door to decide whether or not they could try something Jewish. I appreciate the support, and I have a lot of rachmanis for people who are deciding other things, and believe me, I'm up at night trying to figure out if I'm doing the right thing. In any case, I haven't looked back, and for me, it mainly hinged on the fact that I wanted the conversation to be not about, are you Jewish? Do you have the proper birth certificate? I wanted it to be about who's ready to do something Jewish. If you are willing to do something Jewish, then we have what to do together. We can study, we can have Shabbat. We can go over to Glide and feed the homeless together. But if you're not willing to do anything, you may have the most perfect pedigree, but there's not much I can do with you. So the kitchen is really a place of experimentation where anybody can come in, I should say experientialism, where people can come in and experience. We don't talk about how important it is to do Shabbat at the kitchen. We do Shabbat. And I am very pushy. I make people try things all the time. And I think that is a big key. That's the second thing that I've learned, is that it has to be based in experience, and it has to be, we need to start the conversation not with, are you allowed to be here, but with what are you willing to try? What are you willing to do? I like to say that there are people who are licensed and people who can drive. The Jewish community has done enough with the licensing. We've spent all our energy and time on licensing, and meanwhile, the people on the road are a disaster. We need to start spending time getting people behind the wheel, comfortable, going places, and enjoying the ride. The third and last thing that I'll bring up is that I think Judaism has to matter on the street. I get in big arguments with my father, who's a rabbi. He's a Kabbalist. His Judaism is an internal spirituality. What are you bothering with all this politics and stuff? But I think that if we can't figure out a way to connect what's happening in Torah and in our shuls to what's happening on the street, even if we get in trouble, even if we don't always agree with one another, then it becomes quickly like a tchotchke. It becomes a precious thing that you take off the shelf once or twice a year, and it quickly becomes irrelevant. But if it has to do with what's going on in our lives, of course, personally, but also communally, then I think we have a huge role to play. And the last thing, because I told you there were 3 things, and I'm a rabbi, so there's 4. The last thing is, my guess is that when the people in this room got involved in Jewish life, they were younger than they are now. That we were younger than we are now, right? Somebody made room for you to get involved. Somebody brought you along. Or maybe you found a problem that you wanted to solve and you tried to solve it. The idea, many people ask me, how do we get them to come, meaning the younger people? The first thing I'll say is, by younger people, you mean anybody under whatever age of the moment. Advertisers only talk to people up to age 24. In the Jewish community, younger can be anything, I think, under 65 at this point. So I usually say, which generation are you talking about? Because there's a lot of younger people. But I think actually there's something inherently condescending about the question that we have to recognize. How do we get them to be involved? They are going to have to figure out how to build it for themselves. And we either need to make room or step aside so that new things can be born.
I want to interrogate that idea a moment, if I can.
Please.
You started something new. Now that takes tremendous courage and tremendous vision and tremendous persistence. But in a certain way, starting with something that already is, yesh me yesh, is even harder. And half of the room now is saying to themselves, but Rabbi, I have a minion of people who are over the age of, well, Moses, right? And they come every week, and they donate the money every time, and they control the leadership of the congregation. If I were to step in front of them and say, I'm changing my congregation to make it look like an emergent, like yours, I'm going to change the messaging and the branding and the melodies and the tradition, and I'm going to make it a young person's synagogue, they'll kill me. They won't even bother firing me. They'll just kill me on the floor of the board. What do I? And I don't want to take away from them the congregation they've come to love. What do I do about them if I want to move in another direction?
I've thought a lot about this. I really think this is a yes and. And first of all, I agree. I think the good news about starting something is that you get to create a culture from the ground up, and that's an incredible luxury, one that I don't deny. The hard thing about starting something is you have to do all the work yourself, but that's another. But in terms of having vatzikim, or having people that you want to treat well and with respect, I think it can be a yes and. I was saying this in the earlier session. I think that it's possible to create what I'm going to call, since we just had Archie, a second brand within the community. So I think about Pottery Barn and West Elm as my go-to. Okay, Pottery Barn and West Elm, they're all selling housewares. And excuse me for using, the language of the marketplace in Chol to talk about something that is very, very holy and precious. But I think here, in terms of distribution, it helps. Pottery Barn and West Elm, they have the same trucks, they have the same manufacturing, they have a lot of the same resources, but they have a different brand. I think it wouldn't be hard to create another setting for people who maybe don't come yet. Maybe it's off-site, maybe it's within the building, but you don't have to take anything away from the people who are already enjoying the way that they pray. If the people who are praying in a certain way are upset by a new idea, I think that's a more serious conversation about whether they're creating something only for themselves or whether they want to see something grow and flourish. And I think it's a difficult conversation. But I think in terms of transmitting Torah to the next generation, I think about it a lot. I have 3 daughters. They're teenagers now. And as bittersweet as it is, the goal of my raising my daughters is not that they grow up and move back home and do everything that I do. The goal is for them to grow up and make lives for themselves, maybe even lives, parts of which I won't understand. But I think it's the same. I think sometimes Jewish institutions function like families, and maybe we see the idea of somebody trying something new as a betrayal. But in fact, it's the ultimate compliment. They want to take Torah and put it into a language that they can understand.
I want to drill down on one particular aspect. In my experience, I found that in terms of learning opens up doors to people despite their background or lack of background. It's a much more pluralistic experience, and it demands less of people. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to know Hebrew. You don't have to have a set of presumptions. But prayer is different. Prayer is much more difficult to deal with at this moment in our history. And ironically, prayer is the most difficult thing we do, and it's the biggest thing we do. The biggest room in a synagogue is the prayer space. And the weekly meeting of the community is a prayer meeting, and yet, at least in my experience, it's the thing that most of our communities have the most difficulty with. And then some member of my shul goes to New York, and they go visit David at Rumamu. Or they'll go to LA and they'll go visit Sharon at Ikar. Or they'll, go see Ami at Lab Shul, and they'll come back all excited. Why can't we be like that? Right? And all I have to do is say, Mr. Goldfarb, it's his fault, right? Because Mr. Goldfarb won't let me change the melody to anything, right? Much less change the whole service. You're dealing with a population of people from widely disparate backgrounds and understandings and faith. How do you do prayer at the kitchen?
So we take very seriously the language of music because that's a universal language. And it doesn't require an a priori signing off on a faith. And we do, if you came in, it would be like a traditional Kabbalat Shabbat in terms of the liturgy and Shabbat morning. We do pray all in Hebrew. But we have trained over a number of years we've used some of the Nava Tehillah like there was last night, and we've brought Hillel Tigay from Ikar, and we've thought a lot about every single piece of liturgy, how we can bring people in. And I get into huge fights, as I'm sure many of the people in this room do, with some of the other people on the davening team. If they bring something that is really beautiful but nobody can sing it, we won't do it. It has to be something that people can actually sing and lose themselves in. And so our tefillot at the kitchen, we do a little bit of teaching throughout, but mostly I think it's about the music.
I want to do a little deeper, because you mentioned something which is not immediately obvious to many of us who work in straight congregations, which is you sit down and plan every service. You sit down and evaluate every prayer. And the standard that you're asking is, what is the experience that this particular prayer and this particular service will lead the congregation to? I mean, I dare say, I won't ask how many of us do that. Most of us get to Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock and we look at the schedule and find out if it's the floor flusher bar mitzvah or the Goldfarb's coming. But to really sit down and plan a service as if it were an event, an experience.
I'll go further than that, because it's so precious to me, and because we took the time and effort to build it. My team knows if I go in, I'm moving chairs every time. The chairs have to be in the right way. I'm going to make myself sound like a control freak, but around these kinds of things, we really are. And now everyone has taken a certain kind of pride. There's a certain kind of way people are greeted at the door. There's a certain series of materials that they'll receive. So every single prayer is transliterated, and there are liturgical poems that are written by the community. The Siddur has been designed. It's been designed for the kitchen. There is materials that ask people when they come in, what if I don't, when I first started, I knew there was a group of questions that were what I call deal breakers in my head. Things that made people think that they didn't belong right away. It relates to what Archie's saying, but it was deeper than that. It was like, what if I don't believe in God? What if I don't know any of these prayers? What if I'm not Jewish? These were deal breakers, and so we have a series of those questions out on a table that somebody could read to know I'm not the only one with these questions. Everything is meticulously planned. We don't always hit our mark, but our bar is very high.
What else can we learn from the kitchen? Those of us who work in straight congregations and with buildings and building funds and sisterhoods and brotherhoods and Hebrew schools and bar mitzvahs and more bar mitzvahs and more bar mitzvahs. What else would you want us to know? If you could share the experience, would you desperately want that community to learn from your experience?
Number one, I would say you're doing exactly the right thing. You're working on behalf of Torah, and Torah lives. It is the most precious thing that we have, and there are people who desperately want it. I meet them every day. They're not able to find their way into the culture sometimes, but don't take that as a sign that they don't want what you have. They very much want what you have, and if we can figure out a way to build a bridge from here to there, if we can figure out a way to connect heaven and earth, and mostly if we can model for them with love, they'll come. They'll come and they'll come back.
I'm very taken with a particular image in my study. It's the image of Yochanan ben Zakkai on the day after the temple was destroyed. And I wonder if I could offer you a thought experiment to take home. So the temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av in the year 70. On a sunny August afternoon in the year 70, everything that was sacred to the Jewish people came crashing down. Every single thing, because the Beit HaMikdash was the place where heaven and earth touched. The Beit HaMikdash was the place where people accessed God. The Beit HaMikdash was the center of culture and life. And it was all destroyed very suddenly in one afternoon in the year 70. And in my imagination, the few refugees that were left in the country, they found their way to Yochanan ben Zakkai in Yavne because he had cut a separate peace with the Romans. And they stood in front of the Rebbe because he was the last spiritual master. He was the last Jedi in the world. And they came to him and they asked him in good Palestinian Aramaic, Wie geht's? Where do we go now? I mean, everything that we hold sacred, everything that we hold dear, every connection to our identity and our history and our past is gone. What do we do now? And it occurs to me, at least in my imagination, that Rabbi Yochanan had three choices in front of him. Number one, he could have said to the community, this is the end of the Jewish project. That a God who would allow his Torah, his people, his city, his temple, and his Torah to be desecrated in one afternoon, the Romans are right. There is no God. Go be a Roman. Go be something else. We could have ended the Jewish project on that afternoon. The second possibility is he could have said to them what would have been a small c conservative answer. He could have said to them, look, God destroyed Pharaoh with 10 plagues. God will destroy the Romans. Just wait and see. Let's just wait and see what happens next. Let's just wait. And that would have lasted maybe a generation. We would have lasted one generation waiting to see the miracle that came or wouldn't come. But after a generation, the younger generation would say there's nothing here for us. It seems to me that Rabbi Yochanan made a third choice. He decided to recreate Judaism. And in my mind, although there's no literary record of this, I can imagine what he said. I think he quoted his great teacher, whose name was Shimon HaTzadik, who said, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. First of all, he said, ha'olam omed. You didn't lose a world, you lost a building in Jerusalem. To say ha'olam omed after a catastrophe like that is a radical statement. It says we haven't lost everything. In fact, we can minimize what we lost. In fact, what we lost is not nearly as important as what we just gained. If you read Yitz Greenberg's writing, he talks about the idea that the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash did not banish God from the world, it liberated God into the world. And then he said, Al Torah ve'al avodah ve'al gemilut chesed, which all of you know is the birth of a new set of institutions. Instead of Beit Mikdash, you have Beit Midrash, the school, the place of Torah. Instead of Beit Mikdash, you have Beit Knesset, you have synagogue. And instead of Beit Mikdash, you now have Bayit, you have a Jewish home. Seems to me that's the most radical moment of discontinuity in Jewish history. And I wonder whether we are matching it. Because after all, the greatest moment of redemption in the history of the Jewish people is Yitziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And we've witnessed the return to the land of Israel, which certainly matches that. And the greatest act of destruction is the destruction of the temple in 70, and the Holocaust certainly matches that. Except that Yitziat Mitzrayim and Churban Abayit took place 1,500 years apart. We've experienced the Holocaust in Israel in one generation. And we've done it in the context of modernity, which means that we lack the intellectual superstructure to absorb that level of catastrophe. And that American freedom, and this is what Yehuda spoke about, American freedom has added to that sense of catastrophe and given us an entirely new Jewish world. We are Yochanan ben Zakkai on the day after. And we have the same three choices he did. We can say to our people, look, it's just not working anymore. Go do something else on Saturday morning. Or we can say to our people, let's keep doing what we always did. Let's keep doing it the way we always do it, because that's our impulse. Or we can do what Yochanan did, which is to say, ha'olam omed, but on new foundations. The world stands on new foundations. So I present to you the following crazy thought experiment. And if your rabbi's here, nudge him a little bit or her a little bit so you can go home and do this. There are no more Jews. There's no more Jewish community. There's no more Jewish institutions. And there's no more Jewish leaders, at least as we defined them a generation ago. There's no more Jews as we defined them a generation ago. And all of you know this, and if you don't know this, ask Noah what goes on in San Francisco, because what happens in San Francisco will be in a neighborhood near you within the next 20 years. Mixed families, people of various races and cultures and backgrounds and faiths and non-faiths, but all of whom will come in front of us with the impulse to join us because they have a sense that Jewish offers something to their lives. But our definitions of what it means to say I'm Jewish have completely been blown away. There's no more Jewish community. I can prove this one. All I have to say is certain key words about Israel's policies about the policies, and half of the room will turn this way, and half of the room will turn this way, and we'll turn against each other, and we'll start killing each other. There's no sense of community, of solidarity anymore. What unites us is deeply in question. And the institutions that we represent, they have to change. Because like the temple of Yochanan ben Zakkai, we don't have that anymore. Yes, there's a minion of old people in my shul who love to come to shul and do it the way they used to do. But they're not long for this world. So what we create next is going to be what the synagogue represents next. And then that comes to Jewish leaders. And that's our responsibility. We have to decide what it is our principal job is. Is our principal job to defend continuity, to transmit, to conserve, to preserve, to protect? Or is our principal job to create anew? Is our principal job to envision what Jewish life might be? What it might be for our children and their children? And this is going to be this is the principal question of this conference, and the principal question upon which the survival of conservative Judaism and all of its institutions lay, and the principal question upon which all of American Judaism lies. What is it? How do we define our role as leaders? And I'll leave you with one small thought. In 1964, Look magazine, which was then the second most widely read news magazine in North America after Life, published a cover article called The Vanishing American Jew. It was written by a senior editor named Thomas Newman, who gathered up all of the community studies that had been done in the previous decade, and based on rates of intermarriage, falling rates of birth, falling affiliation rates, waning identification. He said, look, by the year, this is 64, they were entering second, third generation American Jews. By the 1980s, the Jewish community will begin to wane completely, and by 2000, there'll be virtually no Jews left in America. Look magazine, May 1964. Well, here's the interesting fact. Look magazine is gone. And we're still here. And we're still here. Yeah, you can clap for that. That's okay. First, you can clap for the fact that we're still here. And second, you can clap because we're congregational rabbis. We never hear clapping, so. No one ever applauds after a sermon and says, far out, Rabbi, that was great. Do it again, you know. We're still here because the rubric of ethnic assimilation and ethnic disappearance in America doesn't quite capture who and what we are. There's something else going on. There's a deep creativity, a deep strain of cultural resilience, a deep strain of spiritual reawakening that finds its place within the contemporary Jewish community. That's why we said at the beginning, all we need is what we have inside. We have to tap that sense of creativity, tap that spiritual reawakening, and have the courage to say, Al shlosha dvarim ha'olam omed. On new foundations will the world be built. The synagogue that we built will be a synagogue, but it ain't gonna look nothing like my Zeta synagogue. But it just might be the synagogue that my grandchildren and their children will find as a holy place. Thank you for listening tonight. Thank you to Rabbi Kushner.